Thank you very much. Hello, I'm Jeff Cross. I'm really happy to talk about this today. This is an exciting topic of pre-rendering. And pre-rendering is a word that maybe you don't know what it means, or you have an idea of what it means. It's different from what I mean of it. And actually, we talked about what is the right thing to call this. Is this universal? Is this pre-rendering, re-rendering? Lots of different words. So like all scientific studies, I took to Twitter to do a poll to see what we should call it. And we had universal rendering, pre-rendering, or Patrick JSing to honor Patrick JS, who did the original universal implementation. So as you can see, Patrick JSing won, and so my talk today is actually Angular Patrick JSing for SEO speed and happy users. So congratulations, Patrick, if you're watching. You couldn't be here today, but I'll share these slides later. I go really quickly through slides because my slides are my notes, and you won't be able to take pictures of anything interesting, so I'll tweet them later, so you've got to follow me and get them there if you want to see anything again. I'm on the co-founding team at Narwhal.io, used to be on the Angular team. I was the tech lead of Angular Mobile. We worked on things like progressive web apps, good tooling, pre-rendering, a lot of fun things. Alex Rickabaugh is now taking on that effort. And now I'm an Angular consultant at Narwhal with Victor Safkin, who you met earlier today. A couple of shameless plugs. Check out our website. We blog a lot about Angular. Our Twitter, we tweet those things, and we've got this book, which is a great advanced overview of what Angular is. And also we have a booth, and we've sponsored NGConf this year, so come and say hi to us the times between we're talking or doing something else. And we are really nice people. So we're going to talk about pre-rendering. I know I said Patrick JSing, but I didn't have time to edit all my slides after the results came in, so we'll just say pre-rendering from now on. I think most people, like I think Alex Rickabaugh, would prefer to say universal or universal rendering, so take this as me calling it pre-rendering, and the official is just say universal rendering going forward. But we're going to talk in particular about Angular 4.x and what pre-rendering looks like in the latest release of Angular. And you may ask, Jeff, what is pre-rendering? And I've tried to get a succinct definition for what it means for my talk today, but Google came up empty. So let's come up with a common definition of what it is. To render an Angular application in whole or in part before sending the HTML document to the browser. In other words, I want to see what's on the left here, where my document already has content and tags already figured out, as if Angular's already bootstrapped my application, but I want this to be what's returned when I request the document before Angular actually bootstraps in the browser. And you may also say, Jeff, wasn't there already a project called Universal that did Angular pre-rendering? And I would say yes. There was a project called Angular Universal led by some community members, and this was going since Angular was rather young. They started in early betas, I think, of Angular, and this was led by a few folks, Patrick JS, who I mentioned earlier, who's now a Verb, Mark Pyzik, Jeff Welpley, Wasim, and who's the fifth one? Oh, I guess I happen to be the fifth top contributor to Universal. I just chose 5. I didn't realize I was going to end up on my own slides, but anyway, there you go. That was supposed to be a joke, but nobody laughed. So, but I am in the top 5. I was surprised to find. But now it's a first-class part of Angular, which is awesome. So it's been used so much, and it's such an important project that developing outside of Angular was getting difficult to keep it in sync and to keep up with new cool things in Angular. And so now it's been brought into core, led by folks on the Angular team, Vikram and Alex, and also Jason Jean from Forums has been getting more involved in some of the integrations and testing with it. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about history, defined pre-rendering, but let's back up and talk about why it matters. So we wanted to have a blog. And this is just an illustration because our blog is actually just on Medium. We didn't actually build it ourselves, but let's look at a blog as a common use case for an app that could benefit from pre-rendering. We have this page where it lists our blog articles, and then you dive in and you read a blog article on a detail page. The things we care about for this blog are we want it to load fast because we want people to read our articles and not leave and get frustrated. And Rob shared this in his keynote earlier, but if your app takes longer than 3 seconds to load, about 53% of your users are going to get frustrated and abandon on mobile. And so it's not that easy to hit 3 seconds. It's easy to get that wrong if you do some things incorrectly. And there are some things we can do using pre-rendering that I'll talk about later to get us under that mark. And second, we want it to be scrapable. So when people share our blog articles on Facebook, we want everyone to see how pretty our graphics are and see the actual title of the content, some description of the content. We don't want it to just be some link that has no context. And same with Twitter. And finally, we want it to be crawlable. We want, when people look for blog articles written by us, we want them to find them instead of seeing empty search results pages. And so we've got these 3 priorities. And you probably think, well, Angular is supposed to be good at these things, right? And yes, Angular is good at these things. And actually, most of these things you can accomplish with Angular by itself. But let's talk about some of the priorities in more detail and where Angular gets us and where there's still some room to improve. One, if we look at the download time and bootstrap time, Angular gives us AOT, so we can do the work of compiling our application up front, which lets us shake a lot of size from our bundles that we put out, and also a lot of work that would otherwise happen in the browser at runtime. We can shift that to a build step. And then Angular supports lazy loading out of the box. And so this lets us split up our application into several parts, so you can only load what's needed when you need it, and save some of that download and have a faster bootstrapping experience. But where can we make this a little bit better? Well, the thing I want to focus on here is the time between the HTML loading, so when your first request actually returns an HTML page, and the time when Angular is done bootstrapping. So there's this time the HTML is loaded, JavaScript starts executing, Angular bootstraps. How can we make that better? And before I talk about how we make it better, let's talk about the metrics we want to see improved here. There are 2 key metrics when I think about loading that I really want to get right. The time to first meaningful paint, or when I see content I care about, and then the time to interactive, which is when I can start doing things with the application and it responds to me in the way I expect it to. So let's look at comparing no pre-rendering with pre-rendering, how these things work. So if I have a typical cycle, on the blue part is where I'm loading something over the network, my HTML page, and the green part is when that page is parsed and rendered and JavaScript starts executing and Angular bootstraps, eventually ending with my app becoming interactive. Now with Angular CLI, you'll get a page like you see at the beginning here, where you'll have a loading indicator, which you should replace with something better, but the default is you have this loading text, and then finally you see some content on your page once Angular's done bootstrapping. So that's not a great experience as a user. If I load your content, I'd like to see your content sooner. And so with pre-rendering, we can actually shift the time the user sees something on the page to as soon as the document is loaded from the server, because the markup and the CSS are already there and the browser can render those statically without having to execute JavaScript. I'll say in this chart, the time to load the HTML is the same. That won't always be the case in production. If you're doing more computation on your server at request time to serve the document, it's probably going to be a little bit longer because you're doing some more work on the server. But you'll still, in most cases, if you do it right, you'll still have the first meaningful content far ahead of when Angular's done bootstrapping. So scrapable. So social scrapers. They like to see some things on your page like specific meta tags. The prominent scrapers, they all want to see their own kind of meta tags, like Facebook and Twitter have meta tags they recommend you use. In some cases, they'll look at the body to figure out what content there is, so when somebody shares something to Facebook, it'll show a little bit of a preview in the timeline of what your content is. Another thing they like to see is canonical URLs. So if you have the same content that can be accessed at different URLs, they want to know what the single authoritative URL is for that, and they want you to tell them that by using the link rel preload tag. And they typically don't execute JavaScript. So these meta tags and the link rel preload they want to see, you need to have those in the document that's returned from the server when their scrapers are requesting that page and parsing it. So for an example from Facebook, they have their open graph specification, and Twitter cards have their own specification for how you can tell them about your page. So they'll pick the right photos, the right description, the right title when people are sharing it to their timelines. And it'll look nice like this instead of bad like this, where it just has the blog title and some link that you have no idea what's just been shared. So that's how to make social scrapers happy, but let's talk about how to make crawlers happy. So search engine crawlers, they have their own kind of requirements they like to see. They want to see a page title, just using the title tag. They want to see a meta description. And they also want to see canonical URLs. They also look a lot more at page content, because what they're trying to figure out is what your page actually means. So they care a lot more about the context of your page than the scraper does, which just wants to know how to show your page in a standard fashion. When crawlers crawl your site, they want to know how to show it for specific queries, and they'll show different parts of your content for different queries. And they also use that to know how you should rank for certain queries as one of the factors. The interesting thing about crawlers compared to scrapers is they tend to execute JavaScript, and the Google crawler has particularly gotten really good at this, at being able to render your application and run JavaScript and understand the dynamically rendered content in your application. But they still recommend that you pre-render as a fallback in case the crawler is unable to understand your page rendered with JavaScript. I actually started a blog series on this, and I've given a couple talks on search engine optimization with Angular in particular, which you can find at narwhal.io/SEO. I've got a series I've started, and I'll continue adding to that in the future. So we've talked about our priorities and specifically what things we need to get right to hit these priorities. And let me, with that, introduce you to pre-rendering in Angular 4.x. And this is familiar to what Rob showed in the keynote this morning, if you were there. But let me quickly go over how this works, how you can do this in a really simple way. So if we look at this code example here, we see that we have this new function from Angular Platform Server, which the Platform Server module has been there for a while, but hasn't really been public API. It's mostly been internal usage for testing and things like that with Angular. But now it's actually a package that you would use to do pre-rendering. And we have a new function called Render Module Factory. And what we can see in our example here is we just pass a module factory that's already been AOT compiled, and then we pass it an object that gives it a document it's just a string of our HTML page, our source page, and then the URL for which it should render. And that returns a promise of our fully rendered HTML, which you can do whatever you'd like with. So this is a really simple building block you could use in any kind of either build script or runtime. You could build a server around this. And then the module we're bringing in is rather simple itself. We basically take the app module that we've already built for our application and then import it as well as a server module from Platform Server. And then we have it bootstrap our app component, and this is all that we have to do. And I'll talk a little bit more about that server module in just a minute. And then if we look at the app module, it's pretty close to what we would write if we were not doing pre-rendering, other than calling this method with server transition, which just gives a string to Angular so it can do things like CSS prefixing and other things properly between the transition of server and client so that it's using some of the same naming. So basically we have this kind of tree. We have our app server module, which is bringing in the server module from Angular, and it's also bringing in our own app module, which is bringing in browser module for Angular. Let's talk about the server module and what's special about that and why we need to have that. What this does is overrides platform-specific features for you so that you can write your application as if you weren't running on the server. There are some things you should do differently and you could do differently to optimize things on the server, but for the most part, you could just bring in server module and things like HTTP requests will work out of the box because they've overridden it with a node-specific HTTP library. Also locations, so you can do routing seamlessly on the server, and also a DOM implementation so it knows how to render your DOM. So that's a little bit about what it is and the new APIs, but let's talk about what's actually happening, what's the life cycle of pre-rendering, and think about how you could think about what your strategy for pre-rendering could or should be. I've brought it into 4 steps that I think generally capture what pre-rendering looks like for folks: rendering, serving, bootstrapping, and replaying. So let's talk about rendering. So I've got a scary graph here, but if we just take a moment to look at it, I generally break down some of the decisions about how you pre-render into 2 axes, which is the completeness of what you're rendering and when it's rendered. And we have 2 extremes for when it's rendered. You can render everything at request time. So a request comes in, you completely render the document based on whatever variables you have for that request, and then you serve it. And the other extreme is you do it at build time. So you pre-render your entire application or whatever you're going to pre-render in the build step before you deploy. And on the completeness spectrum, you've got rendering a partial screen and then rendering an entire screen. So if you look at the left end of the spectrum, doing things at build time, you'll have the best runtime performance if you would pre-render your entire application as part of a build step, because then you're not having to do any work other than serving from a cache at runtime when requests are received. But the trade-off is that at request time, you can make everything dynamic. You can look at the user, you can look at their locale, you can look at whatever fresh data you have and serve it with the request at request time at the cost of higher runtime cost. You'll have to do more computation when serving each request, so it's going to add more time between when you're serving a request, it's going to add more time to the user downloading that. And then if we look at the completeness, the trade-offs are that it's simpler usually to render an entire screen because you can pretty much just take your existing app and say, when this route is done, or when this route comes in, render this screen for the route, rather than rendering only certain components, which is less computation at runtime, but requires you to think more about how you run your application. So give some examples of like real-world cases. App shell that Rob mentioned a little bit today, like when you have as little of your app as possible that's pre-rendered, then you would have like your header, your title, and maybe a loading indicator. That falls on the corner of the spectrum where you're going to do it at build time as part of your build process to just build this Chrome around that'll get served when a user requests your site. And it's also not very complete because it has very little of your actual application. And if you take something like a blog post, if you have a blog the size of ours, you could very easily pre-render the whole thing at build time because it doesn't have a lot of user-specific or timely data. We could actually, we have tens of articles, so we could actually pre-render the whole thing pretty quickly and serve already generated HTML pages from a cache in production for really fast serving. And if you have something like a product page for an e-commerce site, there may be some things on that that are more timely, like if the prices change often, and you may want to render a good amount of the page, like a lot of the content and stuff that matters for SEO, but you probably won't render the entire screen. Like you could have shopping carts or other user-specific data that you could wait to render at runtime in the browser once Angular's bootstrapping, so you can save some work on the server, and you could actually cache that as you go. And then the news article is kind of the same, like it's more timely. And at the extreme, we have something like a bank statement, which is really user-specific. You're probably not going to want to cache that because it's got to be fresh. I want to see my account balance from now, not from yesterday. And I want to see transactions. And so it's probably not something you want to cache. And I can't really share it between users. So that's kind of the extreme of when you want to render. So when thinking about how to incorporate it into your own process, here are the considerations you'll want to keep in mind. The number of pages, how much content do I have to pre-render, and how long is that going to take? Like how many products, articles do I have? Do I want to pre-render every localization of my content? And do I need to have specific user data in what's pre-rendered, or can I defer that to after the page has been bootstrapped in the browser? And then your content freshness requirements. So if you need to have something that's up to date, like a bank statement, or or a blog, or comments, or Twitter timeline, obviously that's not going to lend itself very well to build time pre-rendering. And the frequency of application deployment. So if you have 1 million pages you have to pre-render, and it takes you hours to pre-render all that, that's probably going to be something you don't want part of your continuous development process. So we've covered the hardest part of this whole life cycle, which is the actual rendering and how and when you do it. Let's talk about serving. The server gets a request for a page, and it serves a pre-rendered page from your cache if you've pre-built it, or it lazily pre-renders from a route, and that's all you need to know about serving. You can figure out the rest based on your own infrastructure. But the ideal is that if you've already got a page rendered in a map, you just kick it back to the server, and if you need to do something else with it, you can. But that part is pretty simple compared to everything else here. So the bootstrap and swap, this is one of the areas that's a little bit more confusing. It can be confusing, I should say. So in the process, so I have this e-commerce site. When I pre-render something from the server, this is what comes back. It's an HTML page that no JavaScript has run in my browser yet to render it, but I can see product details, and I can see that I want to buy a narwhal. But I see my shopping cart on the right. It doesn't do anything right now. It just says loading and pay. So this kind of goes to what I was saying earlier about partial rendering, where you can render the key content, but not the dynamic content. You can put a placeholder there and let the browser take care of it. And then when that's loaded, Angular loads and begins bootstrapping the app in the browser. And when it's done preloading, or when it's done bootstrapping, then it will destroy the previous element that was returned from the server, and then it will take over with its own new element with completely pre-rendered interactive dynamic content. And we can see my shopping cart is now active. It took over where the old shopping cart was, and it's got my dynamic data. So that's the bootstrap process. And let's talk about replay. This is a little bit more of an advanced topic. So the pre-rendered page that I get from the server, it's just HTML and CSS with JavaScript that's going to start loading. But you may wonder, what happens if the user starts interacting, like typing in an input? And I may say, I'm glad you asked. There are two ways that you could deal with this situation. You could not render interactive components, just render components that they can read, that have data to look at, or you could record and replay user events. I like the way Google Docs handles this with their UI. When I start loading a Google Doc, it has all these controls I can see, but they don't actually work yet. They're all disabled. And so I kind of feel like something's happening, I can see it working, and then once the page is done bootstrapping, everything becomes interactive. And I think this is a pretty good user experience. It's a good trade-off that most applications should strive for this kind of design. The alternative is you can use Preboot.js, which is something Jeff Welpley's been worked on for some time, which I think right now there's some things to be worked out with Universal. I'm looking at Alex Zirkabal for confirmation. A couple of things to work on with the new Universal integration, but basically how this works is it records user events on your page and the elements they're associated with on the pre-rendered page, and then once Angular's done bootstrapping in the client, it will replay those on the other elements that have been dynamically bootstrapped. You don't want to assume that this will work automatically. You want to be really careful about the interactive elements you're rendering and relying on pre-boot, just because there are things like if you're typing in forms, it's not actually running validators while it's recording things, and so the user may end up in a state of the pre-rendered application that wouldn't be possible to get into the bootstrapped application. So you want to be conscious about how you're using that. But that's an overview of what's actually, how it's working with pre-rendering, and now you understand pre-rendering with Angular 4.x. And your final question may be, this sounds great, should I pre-render my app, and how much will it cost me? If these things matter to you, you should do some sort of pre-rendering. If you care about fast loading or making users happy and seeing something happening or some kind of progress, you should at least have an app shell or at least strive to have the above the fold or the key content of your page pre-rendered from the server and as Angular is continuing to bootstrap. But to get started with this, you can go to angular.io coming soon. The docs team is really working hard on getting great docs for using pre-rendering right now. It's in progress, so they want to make sure it's correct and good. Keep a track of, I'll be tweeting about it. Angular, I'm sure, will tweet about it as they come on board. Yeah, those docs will be online soon, and you can go pre-render something. Thank you.